Okay, so now for historical myths, we're going to talk about a couple of important events in the life of Muhammad and after the life of Muhammad. Sorry, that's a weird thing there. Okay, so the first one is or are the revelations. So remember, Muhammad received his first revelation in the cave when he went out to Mount Hira by himself when he was 40 years old. And he continued to receive those revelations for the rest of his life. He lived to be 62 years old, so over the next 22 years, he was constantly receiving those revelations. Um, and sometimes they would happen kind of in quick succession. Sometimes they would come very soon after each other. And sometimes there could be, days or weeks or months in between the revelations. But throughout the rest of his life, Muhammad continued to receive these revelations. And sometimes they'd happen in private, but sometimes they'd happen in public. And there are lots of stories about people who witnessed Muhammad receiving a revelation. And basically, they would say that it was very clear to them when Muhammad would be receiving a revelation. It was something that he would just stop in the middle of whatever he was doing, if he was talking or doing some sort of physical activity. He would stop and he would kind of what looked like would go into like a trance-like state, and he would just sort of be enwrapped by this experience. And you couldn't talk to him, you couldn't communicate with him. He was just fully absorbed in this experience. And after a few minutes or sometimes longer, he would come out of this state, and that afterwards he would just be he would be physically hurt, that it was physically painful to receive these revelations. So his whole body would ache and he would just be exhausted. It was very tiring to receive these revelations. So what would happen is he would receive this revelation. Everybody who was around him would know that this was happening. It'd be very clear to them that this is happening. After the revelation was complete, again, he would be in pain, he would be exhausted, and he'd have to go and basically lie down and rest and recover from receiving the revelation. But as soon as he felt strong enough to, he would speak that revelation to the community. So, everyone would gather, they would gather everyone who was there to come and hear the next revelation. So Muhammad would speak the revelation to the community, and then the community would listen to it, and some would memorize it, and some would write it down if they were literate. And so this is these 22 years of revelation. That is what is in the Quran. So the Quran is the sacred text of Islam. The word Quran just means recitation. So it is all of the recitations that Muhammad recited, right? It's all of the revelations that he recited to his community when he received them from God. So we'll talk more about the Quran as we go through the whole unit, but it's important to know, so the Quran is not understood to be written by Muhammad. So its source, its author is not Muhammad. Its source is God. And that Muhammad was just the vessel, was just the human being through which God was communicating this information. So the Quran is also, it's not about Muhammad. It's not like stories about Muhammad. Muhammad is actually in the Quran very, very little. He's not a main figure in the Quran. He's just the person that sort of funneled this information to humanity, the revelations, and that's what's in the Quran. I was going to say something else. I don't remember. Also, it's important to know, we mentioned this in the historical overview, but Muhammad was not a very educated man. He was illiterate. He could not read or write. And this is very important to Muslims because it means that there is no possible way that he could have written the Quran, because he couldn't write anything down anyways. But also his level of education, he could never have come up with the sort of high sophistication of the writing style of the Quran. So it's also important to know that the Quran is actually written in verse. It's a piece of poetry, and that is only that's only apparent when it is heard in Arabic. So the Quran is only the Quran in Arabic because the understanding is that God used the Arabic language to convey that message. So it's only the actual word of God when it's still in Arabic. And that this was a perfect line of transmission, right? As I said before, that the angel Gabriel spoke these words in Arabic to Muhammad. Then Muhammad would recite them to his community. The community would memorize them or write them down. And then those recitations were compiled into the Quran. The Quran was not compiled during the lifetime of Muhammad, but it was compiled pretty much immediately afterwards. After Muhammad died, there was sort of a consensus in the community that these verses needed to be written down. The revelations needed to be written down so that they would all be sort of collected and safeguarded. So basically, several leaders of the Muslim community sort of formed a committee. They got together and they collected all of the writings that people had of the recitations, and also everyone who had memorized it would come and give their recitation, and they would confirm that each one was the same, that the portions that were memorized, the portions that were written down, they matched each other. So there was multiple confirmations for each revelation, and then those were put into the Quran. So the Quran doesn't appear overnight, but it does get compiled quite quickly in terms of how sacred texts, how long it usually takes sacred texts to be compiled. So within about 20 years of Muhammad's death, we have the finalized canonized version of the Quran. So that's kind of the story of the creation of the Quran. But as I mentioned before, it is important to know that the Quran is written in poetry. And this was very important for the early Muslim community. In Arabian culture, before Islam, it's called pre-Islamic Arabian culture, poetry was a really big deal. It still is a big deal. But poetry was basically the national sport of the Arabian Peninsula. We have football or soccer or baseball, but the Arab tribes had poetry. They loved poetry. So each one of those tribes that we mentioned before, they would usually have like a tribal poet. Somebody who was really good at both writing poetry and reciting poetry, right? That they could present it in a beautiful way. And another reason that people would go into Mecca, the tribes would travel into Mecca, was actually for these large poetry competitions. And the different tribal poets would be like pitted against each other, and they would compete. They would, recite the poems that they had composed, and they would get judged on, who was the best poet. And it was a big point of pride among the tribes of, who had the top poet, which tribe had the best poet. So the Quran being written in poetry is very important. Because Muslims say that the Quran is the most beautiful piece of poetry in Arabic that could ever be created, and that is a proof of its divinity, that no human being could come up with such perfect poetry, that it's so beautiful, and that is also, again, proves that Muhammad couldn't have written it. Because it would need, you'd have to be so trained and have studied poetry so much to be able to compose this level of sophistication of poetry, and that he was in no way prepared to do that. So there's lots of stories from early Islam about people actually hearing the Quran, hearing the recitations, and being overwhelmed by the beauty of it, and then converting to Islam. Because they listened to it and they said, this is so beautiful. This poetry is so beautiful that there's no way it could have been composed by a human being. So I'll post a video of some Quranic recitations, so that you can hear this. This is still the way the Quran is used today. The Quran is recited because it is poetry. It's meant to be recited and actually sung. That you perform the Quran, you recite the Quran. You don't just read it. It's not just a text that's meant to be read. It doesn't really read like a book, like a narrative. It has like different short sections in it that address, lots of different topics, but it's not a cohesive narrative. So it's really more of poetry, and it's meant to be sung. It's meant to be recited. And again, we'll talk more and more about the Quran, but that's a little bit about the origins of it. The next thing that I have here is an event called the Night Journey, or the Miraj. And this is an event that happens to Muhammad while he's living in Medina. And it's very important for him as sort of confirming his role as a prophet and giving him more confidence in that role. There are stories about Muhammad when he first starts receiving the revelations, which is that he's kind of a reluctant prophet. He's kind of a hesitant prophet. He's not excited that this is happening to him because it's not something that most people would want. Because if you start telling people that you're receiving messages from God, most people are not going to believe you, right? You're going to lose, a lot of friends. You're going to lose your social status in some ways. And that did happen to Muhammad. His own family turned against him. So the Night Journey is important for that reason and for other reasons. And there's basically two parts to this night journey, to where he goes. So the first part of it, he's in Medina. He's sleeping, lying in his bed, and he feels himself being lifted up. So he sort of ascends into the sky, and he gets taken to another city that later is found out that it's Jerusalem. And some Muslims talk about this as a physical journey, some talk about it as a spiritual journey, and for some it's both. But he ends up going to Jerusalem. He sort of, lands in Jerusalem, and he's sort of brought to the door of this room. And he opens the doors, and he sees that there are some other guys in the room. He doesn't really know who they are, but as he sort of looks at them more closely, he realizes that it's a bunch of the prophets from the past. He realizes, oh my gosh, there's Adam, and there's Abraham, and there's Moses, and there's Noah, and there's Jesus. And all the prophets are with, not all, but, several of these really important prophets are with him in this room. And he's sort of overwhelmed that he's in the presence of these prophets. And they turn to him and they ask Muhammad, will you lead us in prayer? And this is just overwhelming for Muhammad, that, all of these prophets of God, these holy men, they want me to lead them in prayer. So he's very touched by this, and he does, and he leads them in prayer. And this sort of, shows him, confirms for him, yes, I am a true prophet of God, just like these other individuals were true prophets of God. I am now one of them. I'm now part of this group. I'm one of the prophets of God throughout history. So it's very sort of, personally confirming for him, and that afterwards he feels much more confident in his role as a prophet. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part is that he actually goes up into heaven. So he ascends again. He goes up into heaven. And there's different parts of the story. He kind of goes to different parts of heaven. But eventually he comes into the presence of God. He comes, metaphorically face to face with God. And they start to have a conversation. He starts to talk to God. And God says, you're here. You're my prophet. You are a true prophet of God. And I have my next revelation for you. And this revelation has to do with prayer. And how many times human beings should pray each day. And, that really I've created human beings. I've given them life. So I think that, there's a proper number of times that humans should stop in their day. They should praise God. They should thank God. They should, have a moment of peace with God. And he tells Muhammad, I think the number is 50. I'm going to say that human beings should pray 50 times a day. That's the appropriate amount of love and gratitude and devotion to their Creator. And Muhammad is kind of like, ooh, well, that might be a little bit of a tough sell to the community. That might be hard for human beings to do. Not necessarily, he's not arguing with God, but he tells God this is going to be something that's very difficult for humans to live up to. And so they basically start to talk about it, and they start negotiating. What is a way that they can balance out the proper amount of gratitude for God and also not be overburdened by this requirement. So they basically finally agree on 5 daily prayers, and that's why Muslims pray 5 times each day. So the idea is that Muhammad doesn't necessarily get God down to 5, but they agree that if someone prays 5 times a day, each one of those prayers will count as 10, so that they are still fulfilling the 50 times a day that God thinks is the proper amount of devotion for humans to show. So this is, and then Muhammad goes down. He tells his community about the revelation that Muslims should pray 5 times a day. So that's the night journey. That's a very important event in the life of Muhammad. Sort of really confirms and solidifies for him his role as a true prophet of God. Then the last thing I have here is the death of Muhammad. So Muhammad dies in 632. He dies when he's 62 years old, and he dies of old age, natural causes. So there's nothing sort of tragic or suspicious about his death. But it is still a crisis for the community when he dies, because Muhammad, remember, is the religious as well as the social political leader of this group. So he is the leader. He is, he is in charge of everything. So after he dies, the question becomes, well, who is going to replace him? Who will be Muhammad's successor? Who is qualified to lead the Muslim community now that Muhammad's gone? And there's not a clear successor. There's not, like, Muhammad didn't clearly designate someone. This is, after I'm gone, this is going to be the leader. And Muhammad also didn't have any sons. That's sort of the natural choice in a patriarchal society, is that the firstborn son of someone will replace him. But Muhammad had several children, and he actually did have a few sons, but they died in infancy. So he only had adult daughters. So that sort of natural choice was not there. So basically, there's 2 individuals that emerge as kind of front runners, as individuals that groups of people support, and they think should be the next leader. The first individual is a man named Abu Bakr, Abubakr. Abu, second word, Bakr. And Abu Bakr is very respected in the community. He's a close companion, close confidant of Muhammad, and he's kind of already like Muhammad's right-hand man. He's kind of already like the vice president of this community. As I said, he's very devout. He's very respected in the community. So a lot of people see Abu Bakr as the natural choice. He should be the one that leads the community. But there's another individual that some other members of the community prefer, and his name is Ali, A-L-I, Ali. And Ali is, he's Muhammad's son-in-law, so he's married to Muhammad's oldest daughter, so he's kind of the closest thing to a son that Muhammad had. And he's also a cousin of Muhammad, so he's also related to Muhammad. So he kind of plays, he has these 2 qualifications. And people that supported Ali really saw this biological connection as very important. That Muhammad was so special that really we should only have a leader who's related to Muhammad, so that we're trying to kind of stay as close as possible to who Muhammad was and to those that were close to him. So they see this as a very important qualification of leadership in Islam, that it's somebody who is related by blood to Muhammad. Um, Ultimately, they can't agree. A large number of the community want Abu Bakr, and but there's still a sizable minority that wants Ali to be the next leader. They can't come to agreement, so they end up parting ways. So this disagreement is the basis of the split between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. Sunni Muslims are the ones who originally supported Abu Bakr. One of the reasons they supported him is because, and we'll talk more about this, Muhammad had combined, remember, the religious and the social, the religious leadership and the social leadership. But after Muhammad, a lot of people in the Muslim community said, only Muhammad was able to do that. Only Muhammad could combine those two roles. So really now we should separate them. We should have a social political leader, and then we should have other religious leaders, but we shouldn't ask someone to do both at the same time. So Abu Bakr was to be the social political leader. So he became the first caliph, which we'll talk about later. And then Sunnis have other religious leaders that they call imams. But the Shias said that, those who supported Ali, I should say, became the Shia Muslims. And Shias understood it differently. That Muhammad combined the religious and the social, so that we should follow that example. We should try to continue that tradition, and that if Muhammad did it, the next leader, then leaders should do that as well. So for them, they also have an imam, which they see as their leader, and that imam combines both the spiritual and the social political leadership. But it has to be somebody who's related to Muhammad. We'll see there's different ideas about how someone is chosen, and what type of authority that they have. So that's just a little bit about the initial split, and where that division comes from. But we are going to talk much more in depth about the differences that have emerged through time, because they've obviously been developing independently for hundreds of years. So there are other differences now between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Okay, so that's all for historical myths, and then next we'll talk about the myths of endings.